Somewhere in your late 30s or early 40s, a quiet shift happens. You catch yourself in a mirror under bad lighting, or you notice a younger man getting attention in a room, and something registers. Not panic exactly, more like a slow recalibration, a subtle repositioning of where you believe you stand. And most men, without ever saying it out loud, arrive at the same conclusion. The game is changing, and I am losing ground. That conclusion feels honest. It feels mature even, like you are finally being realistic about how the world works. But here is what nobody tells you, and what most content aimed at men your age refuses to say clearly. That conclusion is wrong. Not partially wrong, structurally wrong, built on a premise that was never accurate to begin with. The premise is this: that physical appearance was ever the primary engine of attraction for a man. That what made you compelling at 28 was your jawline, your hair, your body, and that what is eroding your relevance now is the slow departure of those things. This is the lie, not a small distortion, a complete misreading of the mechanism. It is also an enormously convenient lie for a culture that profits from male insecurity. Grooming industries, fitness marketing, anti-aging products, all of it runs on the same quiet suggestion that your value is housed in your surface and that the surface is expiring. The message is rarely spoken directly. It does not need to be. It is embedded in what is celebrated, what is cast, what is rewarded visually. And men absorb it passively, the way you absorb any belief that is never challenged. What makes this particular lie so effective is that it contains just enough truth to feel credible. Yes, biology is real. Yes, a 25-year-old body is not a 52-year-old body. Nobody is arguing otherwise. But conflating physical change with diminished attractiveness requires you to accept something that psychology, neuroscience, and basic human observation do not actually support. It requires you to believe that attraction, particularly the kind that holds, that deepens, that actually matters beyond a first glance, is primarily a visual transaction. It is not. It never was. So if looks were never the real currency, the question worth sitting with is this: what was? Attraction is not a visual event. It begins there, sometimes in the way a face or a posture registers in the first few seconds. But what sustains it, what converts a passing notice into genuine interest, operates on an entirely different frequency. And that frequency is something most men have never been taught to understand, let alone develop. Here is what the research actually shows, and more importantly, what honest observation confirms. When mature adults, men and women both, describe what draws them powerfully toward another person, they consistently return to the same cluster of qualities: presence, certainty without aggression, the sense that a person knows who they are and is not performing for the room, the feeling, difficult to articulate but immediately recognizable, that this individual has been somewhere real and returned from it intact. None of those qualities photograph well. None of them show up in a gym mirror. And critically, none of them peak at 25. What the nervous system responds to in a mature man is not symmetry. It is settledness. There is a neurological basis for this that is worth understanding without overcomplicating. Human beings are wired at a level beneath conscious thought to assess threat and safety, stability and volatility, depth and shallowness. These assessments happen faster than language, and they are not fooled by surface presentation for long. A young man can project confidence convincingly for an evening. A man who has actually built it over decades does not need to project anything. It radiates differently. It reads differently. The nervous system of the person across from him registers the difference, even if they could never explain why. This is what is meant by presence, not a technique, not eye contact advice from a self-help article. Presence is what remains in a man when he has stopped needing the room to validate him. And it is, without question, one of the most attractive qualities a human being can carry. Groundedness operates the same way. It is not calmness as a performance. It is calmness as a consequence. The consequence of having faced difficulty and not been destroyed by it, of having made decisions with real stakes attached, of having learned through friction rather than theory what actually matters and what does not. That quality is palpable in conversation. It shapes how a man listens, how he responds, how much space he occupies without demanding attention. People feel it before they name it. Earned confidence is the third signal, and it is worth distinguishing from its imitation. Borrowed confidence, the kind assembled from external markers like status, appearance, or social approval, is detectable. It has a faint desperation underneath it, a vigilance, a need to be confirmed. Earned confidence has none of that architecture. It is quieter, more indifferent to outcome, and far more compelling for exactly that reason. Here is the point that changes everything. These signals, presence, groundedness, earned confidence, are not personality traits you are born with or without. They are not genetic. They are not assigned at random. They are built, constructed slowly, often painfully, through the specific material of a life actually lived. Which means the very thing most men are treating as their liability is, in precise psychological terms, their greatest asset. There is a particular kind of calm that only comes from having lost something significant and survived it. Not recovered from it in the way a wound heals cleanly. Survived it in the way that leaves a man permanently reorganized, different in his priorities, quieter in his certainty, less impressed by things that used to seem important and more attentive to things he once moved past too quickly. That calm is not a consolation prize for age. It is a structural transformation, and it is one of the most psychologically compelling qualities a man can possess. Consider what the years between 35 and 55 typically contain for a man who has lived honestly. Failed relationships or the slow erosion of one, career reinvention, voluntary or forced. The death of parents, which does something specific and irreversible to a man's relationship with time. Financial pressure, or the humbling discovery that success does not deliver what it promised. Health scares, friendships that quietly dissolved, versions of himself that he outgrew or abandoned or had stripped away. This is not a list of wounds. This is the biography of a man who engaged with his life rather than managed it from a safe distance. And every single one of those experiences, if a man has processed rather than buried them, leaves a deposit not of bitterness, though that is always a risk, of perspective, of proportion, of the specific intelligence that only arrives when theory is replaced by consequence. This is what younger men cannot manufacture, and it is worth being direct about why. It is not simply that they lack years. It is that certain kinds of understanding are physiologically inaccessible without the experiences that produce them. A 27-year-old can read about loss. He can empathize with it intellectually, but he does not yet carry it in the way a man of 50 does, as a quiet presence in the room, as a softness behind the eyes that signals he has been somewhere real. That signal is not performed. It cannot be. It is the residue of actual living, and it registers in other people at a level that bypasses their conscious analysis. Scar tissue is the wrong metaphor for this, though it is the one most commonly used. Scar tissue suggests damage that hardened over. What actually happens in a man who processes his experience rather than armoring against it is closer to refinement. The unnecessary falls away. The performative gradually becomes exhausting and then simply stops. What remains is something more concentrated, more specific, more honest than what existed before. This is not wisdom as an abstract virtue. It is wisdom as an observable quality, detectable in how a man holds a conversation, how he responds to pressure, how little he needs to dominate or impress. There is also something that happens to a man's relationship with silence as he accumulates real experience. Younger men tend to fill silence because they are still assembling their identity in real time, and silence feels like exposure. A man who knows who he is, not because he decided it intellectually, but because life confirmed it through repeated testing, is comfortable in silence in a way that is genuinely arresting. He does not need to fill the space. He inhabits it. And that quality, that capacity to simply be present without agenda, is something people feel in their bodies before they register it in their minds. All of this is available to a man in his 50s in a way it simply was not at 30. The raw material is there. The architecture has been built, whether he recognizes it or not. The question is why so many men cannot access what they have already earned. Most men in their 50s have built something genuinely substantial inside themselves. The perspective is there, the hard-won calm is there. The capacity for depth that younger men are still years away from accessing, that is there too. And yet, a significant number of those same men move through the world as though none of it exists, as though the internal architecture counts for nothing if the external surface is no longer what it was. This is not a failure of character. It is the predictable outcome of a specific kind of conditioning, one that begins early and runs so deep that most men never think to question it. From the time a man is young, his value is communicated to him through external metrics. Performance, output, appearance, status. The message, rarely explicit but relentlessly consistent, is that worth is demonstrated, not inherent, that you are what you produce, what you earn, what you look like, what you achieve. This framework works reasonably well, or at least feels like it does, when a man is ascending, when the metrics are moving in the right direction. But midlife has a way of disrupting the metrics. Careers plateau or pivot, bodies change. The markers that once provided a reliable sense of standing begin to shift beneath him. And because he was never taught that his value existed independently of those markers, the shift feels like diminishment. What follows for many men is a quiet but corrosive form of self-erasure. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside. It looks like shrinking slightly in social situations, like deferring to younger voices in the room even when his own perspective is sharper, like editing himself in conversation, pulling back observations or opinions that feel too old, too out of step, too much like a man who is no longer the target demographic. It looks like performing energy he does not feel, chasing relevance through adaptation rather than standing inside his own authority. Shame is the engine underneath all of this, though most men would not use that word. It presents instead as pragmatism, as self-awareness, as not wanting to be the guy who does not know his time has passed. But what it actually does is sever a man from the most compelling thing about him. His depth becomes invisible because he has learned to apologize for the age that produced it. This is the conditioning problem, and naming it as conditioning rather than character matters enormously. A character flaw is something a man either has or does not have. Conditioning is something that was installed, which means it can be examined, and over time it can be reversed, not through affirmation or positive thinking, but through the specific and often uncomfortable process of recognizing where you have been contracting yourself to fit a frame that was never built for a man like you. The frame was built for youth. You are no longer youth. And the sooner a man stops trying to fit inside it, the sooner something far more interesting becomes visible. Because there is a version of a man on the other side of all this contraction. A man who has stopped performing, stopped apologizing, stopped competing on terms that were never designed to honor what he has actually become. That man looks like something worth understanding. You have likely met this man at some point, even if you could not immediately explain what made him different. He was not necessarily the most physically striking person in the room. He was not performing. He was not working the space or managing impressions or angling for position. He was simply there, fully and without apology. And something about that quality made him impossible to overlook. That is not charisma as a technique. That is what a man looks like when he has finally stopped spending energy on the exhausting project of proving himself. And it is, in the most precise sense of the word, attractive. The psychological state underneath it is worth naming clearly. It is not arrogance. Arrogance is still a performance, still oriented toward an audience, still dependent on a response. What this man carries is something quieter and far more durable. It is the settledness that arrives when a man has made peace with his own history, not erased it, not rebranded it, made peace with it, including the failures, the detours, the relationships that did not survive, the ambitions that were revised by reality. He's not dragging that history behind him as weight. He is standing on top of it. This is the final illusion worth dismantling, the idea that attraction is something you engineer, that it requires a strategy, a system, a set of optimized behaviors deployed in the right sequence. That framing keeps a man perpetually in his head, calculating, adjusting, performing. It is also, not coincidentally, the framing that keeps certain industries profitable. The truth is simpler and in some ways more demanding. Attraction at this level, the kind that draws people toward a man of genuine depth, is not produced by effort directed outward. It is the byproduct of a man becoming more fully and unapologetically himself, less managed, less edited, less concerned with whether the room approves of what he brought into it. Everything you have lived through, the losses, the recalibrations, the quiet reinventions that nobody saw but you, none of that was subtracted from your value as a man. It was the construction of it. You were not declining, you were being built. And a man who understands that does not need to prove anything to anyone, which is precisely what makes him worth paying attention to.